The rain poured heavily as the Secret Service's Paranormal Division pulled up to the Fitzgerald estate, a crumbling mansion nestled deep in the mist-covered woods of West Baden. The headlights barely cut through the fog, casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. The team had been briefed on the case. A cursed doll locked away for decades had mysteriously reappeared in the hands of the Fitzgerald family, a name that sent shivers down the spine of even the most seasoned investigators. Agent Miles, a grizzled veteran, wiped the sweat from his brow as he exited the vehicle. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered, glancing at his partner, Agent Hart, who was already setting up the ghost hunting equipment. As they approached the mansion, the front door creaked open on its own. The team exchanged uneasy glances. "Classic horror movie stuff," Hart joked, but his voice was laced with tension. Inside, the mansion was worse than they expected. The air was thick with a damp, moldy stench, and the furniture was covered in a layer of dust, as if the house had been abandoned for years. In the center of the room, sitting on an antique wooden chair, was Annabelle, the doll. Her glass eyes seemed to follow them as they stepped closer. Miles pulled out the EMF detector, the needle spiking violently as they approached. "Jesus, the energy in here is off the charts," he whispered, feeling a cold chill crawl down his spine. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the room. The door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The temperature dropped instantly, and the lights flickered. Hart aimed his thermal camera at the doll, and his face went pale. "Miles, we've got movement." The camera picked up a dark, shifting mass hovering behind the doll. Before they could react, the mass lunged toward them, knocking Hart off his feet and sending him crashing into the wall. A guttural growl echoed from the shadows as the dark figure took shape, a towering shadowman with hollow eyes and long, bony fingers. Miles fired his gun, the bullets passing through the figure as if it were smoke. Hart scrambled to his feet, grabbing the holy water from his pack and hurling it at the creature. It shrieked, recoiling momentarily before vanishing into thin air. Breathing heavily, the two agents stared at each other. "We're in way over our heads," Hart said, his voice shaking. "That thing was protecting the doll." Miles nodded, eyes fixed on Annabelle. "Whatever it is, it's just getting started." The next day, the team regrouped at a nearby safe house, but the tension was palpable. Miles couldn't shake the feeling of those hollow eyes watching them, even in the daylight. Hart had spent the night reviewing footage from their cameras, but what he found only deepened their dread. "There's something else," Hart said, his voice low as he pushed the footage across the table. "Look at the timestamp." The footage showed Annabelle, still and lifeless, but in the corner of the screen, a figure appeared, first faint, then solidifying into the shape of a crawler. It skittered across the ceiling, its elongated limbs jerking unnaturally as it crept toward the camera. Then, just as quickly, it vanished. The footage cut to static. "Tell me that's a glitch," Miles muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. Hart shook his head. "It's real, and that's not the worst of it." As if on cue, a call came through on the radio. "Agent Miles, this is headquarters. We've got a situation. Two of the rescue teams sent to retrieve survivors from the Fitzgerald estate. They're missing." A cold dread washed over them. "Missing?" Hart echoed. "What do you mean, missing?" "Last we heard, they entered the woods to secure the perimeter. Then radio silence. We sent another team to track them down. Nothing. Just their vehicles, abandoned. No signs of struggle, no bodies." Miles clenched his jaw, trying to steady his breathing. "It's happening again," he whispered. Before they could react, the door to the safe house slammed open, and a gust of freezing air swept through the room. The lights flickered, and an ear-piercing screech filled the air. Miles drew his weapon, but it was too late. The shadow man materialized in front of them, its hollow eyes locking onto them as it raised a clawed hand. In a heartbeat, Hart was flung across the room, crashing into the table with a sickening thud. Blood smeared the floor as he lay motionless, his chest barely rising. Miles fired a shot, but the shadow man vanished before his eyes. Breathing heavily, Miles dropped to his knees beside Hart, pressing his hand to the wound. "Stay with me," he muttered, his voice shaky. But in the back of his mind, he knew they were next. And the doll? Annabelle was nowhere to be seen. The oppressive silence of the abandoned hotel was shattered by the muffled footsteps of Cassie and her team as they navigated the darkened hallways. The air was thick with dust, and the faded grandeur of the once luxurious lobby was now a testament to years of decay and neglect. Flickering lights cast eerie shadows across the walls, creating distorted shapes that seemed to shift and move just beyond the edge of vision. Cassie shivered despite the warmth of her jacket. The sense of dread was almost palpable. Her breath fogged up the air as she exhaled, each step echoing ominously. "Stay close," she instructed her team. "We don't know what's waiting for us." As they made their way deeper into the hotel, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The air seemed to grow colder, and the whispering sounds, though faint, were relentless. Cassie's EMF meter began to beep erratically, signaling heightened paranormal activity. The lights on their equipment danced frenetically, casting an unsettling glow. Suddenly, a loud crash came from one of the guest rooms. Cassie and her team rushed toward the noise, their footsteps echoing loudly in the deserted hallway. The door to the room was ajar, and as they pushed it open, they were met with a horrifying sight. The room was in disarray, with furniture overturned and personal belongings scattered everywhere. But what was most disturbing were the bloody handprints smeared across the walls and the ceiling. Cassie's heart raced as she stepped cautiously into the room. Her flashlight revealed more disturbing details. A broken mirror with shards scattered on the floor, and a large, dark stain that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "What the hell happened here?" whispered Miles, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, a loud, anguished scream echoed through the hallway. The team spun around, weapons at the ready, but the hallway was empty. The scream seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, a chilling cacophony that left them on edge. Cassie turned her attention back to the room. "We need to find out who was here and what happened to them," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Check for any signs of life." As they searched the room, they found a diary half buried under the debris. Cassie carefully pulled it out and flipped it open. The entries were frantic, filled with scribbles about shadows moving in the corners of the room, whispers in the dark, and an increasing sense of dread. The final entry was a desperate plea for help, ending abruptly with a single sentence: "They're coming for us." Cassie's blood ran cold. "We need to get out of here," she said urgently. "Something is very wrong." The team hurried out of the room and down the hall, but as they reached the staircase, the lights flickered violently and then went out completely. The hotel was plunged into darkness. Cassie's flashlight was the only source of light, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the walls. The whispers grew louder, becoming more insistent. The temperature dropped drastically, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The team's breath came out in visible puffs, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a gaunt, pale woman with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a silent scream. She reached out toward them with skeletal fingers, and her gaze was filled with a soul-crushing despair. "Run!" Cassie shouted, turning on her heel and sprinting down the stairs, her team scrambling behind her. The team stumbled into the basement, desperately trying to escape the relentless pursuit of the shadowy figures. The basement was a labyrinth of old storage rooms, their walls lined with dusty crates and forgotten artifacts. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and decay, and the oppressive darkness seemed to press in from all sides. Cassie's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing old furniture, rusted tools, and cobweb-covered corners. The only sounds were their hurried footsteps and the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe. They moved quickly, their hearts pounding in their chests. "Split up and search the area," Cassie ordered. "We need to find a way out of here." The team members scattered, each one navigating the cluttered space with mounting unease. As Cassie searched through a stack of old boxes, she felt a sudden chill run down her spine. She turned around, expecting to see one of her team members, but instead, she was met with an empty hallway. A low growl reverberated through the basement, causing Cassie's skin to crawl. The temperature dropped sharply, and she could see her breath misting in front of her. She knew that whatever was following them was getting closer. She quickly rejoined her team, who were gathered in a large, open room at the far end of the basement. The room was filled with old, broken furniture and dusty mirrors, their surfaces covered in thick layers of grime. "Any sign of a way out?" Cassie asked, her voice tight with fear. "No, but something's not right," Miles replied, his eyes darting around the room. "I keep feeling like we're being watched." Before Cassie could respond, the mirrors in the room began to shatter, one by one, their glass shards raining down onto the floor. The room was filled with the sound of breaking glass and the unearthly shrieks of the damned. Cassie's flashlight flickered wildly as the shadows in the room twisted and writhed. A figure appeared in one of the broken mirrors, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. His reflection seemed to move independently of the mirror, reaching out toward Cassie with a menacing grin. The room grew colder, and the air was filled with the sound of distant, mournful wails. The team was surrounded, with no clear way out. The shadows closed in, and Cassie could feel the malevolent presence growing stronger. "Back to the stairs!" Cassie shouted, trying to keep her voice steady. "We have to get out of here." As they made their way back to the stairs, the shadows seemed to reach out for them, their cold, clammy fingers brushing against their skin. The basement was alive with a malevolent energy, and the feeling of being trapped was overwhelming. With a final burst of adrenaline, the team reached the stairs and began to ascend, their hearts racing as they struggled to escape the nightmarish presence that haunted the basement. The shadows clung to them, whispering threats and promises of eternal torment. As they emerged into the hallway above, gasping for breath, Cassie looked back at the basement entrance. The darkness seemed to recede, but she knew that whatever they had faced was far from over. The haunted hotel had more secrets to reveal, and the true horror was still waiting to be uncovered. The storm grew fiercer, pounding the West Baden Springs Hotel with relentless force. The team had regrouped in the grand ballroom, the eerie atmosphere of the once elegant room only adding to their growing fear. Dusty chandeliers swayed with the wind, casting flickering shadows on the cracked walls. They had all seen the carnage, the crawler's brutal attack on Hart, and now, the mutilated bodies of the rescue team scattered across the hotel grounds. "Where the hell is backup?" Reyes barked, pacing furiously, his hands clenched into fists. "It doesn't matter," said Cassie, her voice shaking. "This thing, it's not just one spirit. It's the doll, Annabelle. We need to destroy it before more people die." The team had discovered the truth. Annabelle wasn't just an ordinary cursed doll. The demonic entities tied to her, crawlers, skinwalkers, and the shadowman, were bound to her by an ancient ritual, a ritual steeped in the blood of the hotel's dark past. The doll was more than a vessel. It was a gateway, and now that gateway had been ripped open. Suddenly, a chilling cry echoed through the ballroom. Everyone froze. "What was that?" Dan whispered, gripping his thermal camera tightly. The cry came again, louder this time, closer. A deep, guttural wail, like the sound of something suffering, something not of this world. The floor beneath their feet creaked ominously, and the temperature plummeted. They knew what was coming. A shadow swept across the room, impossibly fast. It lingered at the edge of the candlelight they'd set up, just beyond where they could see clearly. Then, like a nightmare brought to life, the Shadowman emerged. Its towering form, nearly 9 feet tall, seemed to flicker in and out of reality. Eyes burning with malice, its elongated arms stretched unnaturally, reaching toward the group. Reyes raised his gun and fired, the bullets uselessly passing through the figure, striking the far wall. The Shadowman didn't even flinch. In a flash, it was upon them. The room erupted into chaos. Reyes was hurled across the ballroom, his body crashing into the piano with a sickening thud. Dan tried to back away, but the creature moved too quickly, grabbing him with one long, gnarled arm. His screams filled the air as the Shadowman dragged him into the darkness, where his cries were abruptly cut off. Cassie grabbed the doll from her backpack, frantically flipping through the pages of the ritual they'd uncovered. "We have to bind it. Now." Just as she said it, the ballroom's floor began to crack and splinter. Something beneath the floorboards was coming up. The wood creaked and snapped as the floor gave way, revealing a dark, endless abyss. From the abyss, crawling up the jagged edges, came the skinwalkers. These twisted creatures, half human, half beast, clambered toward them, their eyes glowing with malevolent hunger. Reyes, battered and bleeding, tried to pull himself up, but a skinwalker was already upon him, ripping into his flesh. Cassie, her hands trembling, began chanting the incantation from the ritual book. "Sanctus demonium te ligamus," she yelled, her voice desperate, fighting to be heard over the screams and the wind howling through the broken windows. But the more she chanted, the more violent the entities became. The room was filled with horrific snarls and screeches, the stench of death thick in the air. Cassie's voice was drowned out as the wind roared, shaking the crumbling walls of the West Baden Springs Hotel. Reyes lay still, his body a mangled heap near the piano, and Dan was gone, pulled into the shadows by the towering demon. Only Cassie and Miles remained, and the skinwalkers were closing in. "You need to finish the ritual," Miles shouted, swinging a broken chair leg at one of the skinwalkers. It shrieked, more out of annoyance than pain, as the blow landed on its twisted form. Cassie, clutching the doll tightly, flipped frantically through the pages. Her eyes darted to the passage she needed, but something felt wrong. The words seemed to shift on the page, dancing and writhing like snakes. "It's not working," she cried, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "They're getting stronger. We're running out of time." The ground beneath them trembled violently as another skinwalker lunged at Miles. He barely managed to dodge, the creature's claws raking across the floor, leaving deep gouges in the wood. The chandelier above them swayed dangerously, and Cassie's breath quickened as she realized the entire hotel might collapse at any moment. The cursed doll, Annabelle, seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy in her arms. The very air around it felt suffocating, thick with dark magic. The entities weren't just drawn to it, they were feeding off it, growing more powerful by the second. Cassie backed toward the center of the room, her mind racing. Desperation clawed at her as she screamed the ritual words louder, each syllable filled with fear and fury. Miles stumbled, barely able to fend off the relentless onslaught. "Cassie, do something." With a surge of determination, she thrust the doll toward the nearest skinwalker, the ancient words spilling from her lips. The creature let out an unearthly howl, recoiling as if struck by some invisible force. But then, something happened that neither of them expected. The doll's eyes opened, glowing with an unnatural, hellish light. "Cassie," Miles whispered, horror dawning on his face. Annabelle was no longer a passive object. The demon inside had awoken, and now it was far worse than they'd imagined. The room became suffocating as Annabelle's glowing eyes cast an eerie red light across the ballroom. The air grew thick with a foul stench, like rotting flesh and sulfur, and the temperature plummeted. It felt as though the hotel itself was alive, groaning and creaking with ancient malice. Miles stepped back, his eyes wide with terror. "Cassie," he whispered again, barely able to speak. "We need to get out of here. Now." But Cassie was frozen, her grip tightening around the cursed doll. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared into the doll's glowing eyes, mesmerized by the unnatural force emanating from it. It felt as though something was pulling her in, whispering to her in a language she couldn't understand but felt deep in her bones. Annabelle's mouth, stitched shut with old, fraying threads, began to twitch. Slowly, impossibly, the stitches unraveled, and a low, guttural growl came from deep within the doll. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and cracks splintered across the floor, radiating outward from where Cassie stood. "Cassie!" Miles shouted, snapping her out of her trance. He grabbed her arm, yanking her backward just as the ground caved in beneath her feet. A massive hole opened up, revealing a pit of writhing shadows and fiery light beneath the ballroom. From the depths, monstrous hands, skeletal, clawed, and covered in decaying flesh, reached upward, grasping at the air. Miles pulled Cassie back just in time, but they both stumbled, falling to the ground as the hotel continued to quake. The skinwalkers and crawlers, now emboldened by the demonic energy flooding the room, were closing in fast. Their eyes glowed with unholy hunger, their mouths dripping with a thick black ooze that hissed as it touched the ground. Cassie's mind raced. The ritual wasn't working. The doll had become more powerful than they could have imagined, and now they were trapped. They needed to destroy Annabelle, but how? As she scrambled to her feet, Cassie noticed something glinting in the debris, a rusted iron spike from the broken chandelier. Desperation surged through her, and without thinking, she grabbed it, her fingers slick with sweat and fear. "We need to destroy the doll," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "It's the only way." Miles glanced at the spike in her hand, then back at the hellish pit beneath them. "How do you even know that'll work? We don't have time to figure it out," she screamed. Just as she said it, the shadowman reappeared, its massive, inky form stretching across the room. It moved toward them, slow and deliberate, its eyes burning with hatred. The skinwalkers followed, their twisted, emaciated forms crawling across the walls and ceiling like grotesque spiders. The room was closing in on them. Cassie tightened her grip on the spike, her knuckles white. She felt the weight of every decision pressing down on her, the crushing reality that failure meant death, or worse. The shadowman loomed closer, its dark form distorting the air around it. Every inch of its presence seemed to suck the light and hope from the room, leaving nothing but despair in its wake. Miles grabbed a broken piece of wood, brandishing it as a futile weapon against the oncoming terror. Cassie, her breath coming in shallow gasps, raised the iron spike high. The doll's eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a sickening pull in her gut, a deep, instinctual fear that what she was about to do would unleash something far worse. But there was no other option. If they didn't act now, they'd be dead within minutes. The shadowman reached out, its hand brushing against Miles' chest. Instantly, his body convulsed, his skin turning gray and brittle as the life was drained from him. He let out a strangled cry, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. "No!" Cassie screamed, her voice cracking. Without thinking, she plunged the iron spike into Annabelle's chest. The doll let out an ear-piercing screech, its mouth gaping wide as black smoke poured out, swirling around the room. The temperature dropped even further, and the lights flickered violently. For a moment, it seemed as though nothing had changed. The shadowman still stood over them, its hand reaching for Miles, who was barely clinging to life. The skinwalkers and crawlers were still closing in, their eyes glowing with malice. Then, with a sudden violent burst, the doll exploded in a shower of dark energy. The force of the blast sent Cassie flying backward, slamming into the crumbling walls of the ballroom. Her vision blurred, and her ears rang from the sheer force of it. When she managed to pull herself up, she saw the shadowman disintegrating, its form breaking apart into tendrils of black smoke that were sucked into the pit below. The skinwalkers and crawlers writhed and screeched, their bodies convulsing as they, too, were dragged into the abyss. But it wasn't over. The ground beneath them continued to crack and split, the hotel now in complete collapse. The pit was widening, consuming everything in its path. Miles, barely conscious, lay near the edge, the ground crumbling beneath him. Cassie rushed to him, her body aching with every step. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back just as the floor gave way completely. The pit yawned open, swallowing the ballroom, the creatures, and the last remnants of the cursed doll. The wind roared as the hotel began to implode, sucked into the hellish void beneath it. Cassie and Miles staggered to their feet, running for the nearest exit as the walls caved in around them. They barely made it out before the hotel collapsed entirely, leaving nothing but a gaping, smoldering crater where West Baden Springs once stood. And somewhere, deep within that pit, Cassie could still feel the presence of something watching. The smoke still hung thick in the air, swirling ominously around the ruins of West Baden Springs Hotel. The once grand structure was now a crater of smoldering debris, as if the earth itself had swallowed the cursed building whole. The eerie silence that followed the collapse was deafening, broken only by the distant crackle of embers and the distant screech of something lurking far below. Cassie and Miles stood at the edge of the crater, their bodies bruised and battered, but their eyes wide with disbelief. The destruction should have ended the nightmare, but the pit before them hummed with a dark energy that twisted the air. Cassie felt it, deep in her bones, a sense that something was still alive down there, something worse than the creatures they had fought. "We need to leave," Miles muttered, his voice trembling. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in the last hour, his face gaunt and pale. "This isn't over. It's just beginning." Cassie shook her head, her heart hammering in her chest. "We can't leave yet. We have to make sure it's really over. She turned to the gaping pit, its blackness seeming to draw her in like an abyss that had no end. Something's still down there. Miles stared at her, eyes wide with fear. Are you insane? Look around. We're lucky to be alive. You want to go back down into that hellhole? Cassie clenched her fists, determination burning through her exhaustion. We don't have a choice. We started this, and we need to finish it. If we don't, whatever is still down there will get out. A low, guttural growl echoed from the pit, sending a shiver down their spines. The earth trembled beneath their feet, and cracks began to spiderweb out from the edge of the crater. Fine, Miles said, his voice barely a whisper. But this is suicide. With a deep breath, Cassie secured the remaining ghost-hunting equipment they had left and began her descent into the crater. The air grew colder with every step, and the walls of the pit seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as if the earth itself was breathing. As they descended, the darkness grew more oppressive, and the foul stench of rot and decay intensified. Strange whispers filled the air, indistinct voices that seemed to call out from the very walls. Cassie's flashlight flickered, barely piercing the dense shadows. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted, and the pit widened. From below, something large and monstrous stirred, its presence sending waves of terror through them both. The shadows coalesced into the figure of the Shadowman, towering and twisted, its hollow eyes locking onto them with a malevolent hunger. The Shadowman stood before them, taller and more imposing than it had ever been. Its twisted form seemed to stretch into the darkness, its limbs long and grotesque, its face a swirling void of emptiness. The growl that emanated from its chest was deep and bone-chilling, reverberating through the very earth itself. Cassie raised the EMF meter, its needle spiking wildly as it reacted to the presence of pure evil. The Shadowman took a step closer, and the ground beneath them trembled, sending small rocks and debris tumbling into the abyss below. Miles gripped her arm, his face pale with terror. We need to go. We can't fight that thing. But Cassie wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked onto the Shadowman, her pulse pounding in her ears. This was it, the source of everything. The demon that had been manipulating Annabelle, the skinwalkers, the crawlers. It all led back to this ancient evil. The air around them grew thick with tension, and Cassie felt a cold, clammy hand grip her ankle. She looked down, horrified to see skeletal fingers clawing their way up from the ground. Dozens of decayed hands emerged from the earth, pulling themselves out of the pit, each one more grotesque than the last. The souls of the damned, trapped here for eternity, were coming for them. Cassie screamed and kicked at the hands, but they tightened their grip, dragging her toward the Shadowman. Miles tried to pull her free, but the ground beneath him gave way, and he fell, tumbling into the darkness below. His scream echoed through the pit, cut short by a sickening thud. Miles! Cassie shrieked, her voice hoarse. She fought against the hands pulling her toward the Shadowman, but it was no use. The demon reached out, its clawed hand inches from her face. Just as all hope seemed lost, a blinding light pierced the darkness. The ground shook violently, and the hands gripping Cassie released her. The Shadowman let out a roar of agony as the light burned through it, its form disintegrating into ash and smoke. Cassie looked up, squinting against the brilliant light, and saw a group of soldiers descending into the pit, their weapons drawn. They were too late to save Miles, but they had arrived just in time to destroy the demon. The light intensified, and with a final, ear-splitting scream, the Shadowman was consumed by the brilliance, leaving nothing but silence and the acrid smell of burning flesh in its wake. Exhausted and trembling, Cassie collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down her face. The nightmare was finally over, but the cost had been too high. As the soldiers helped her out of the pit, Cassie cast one last glance into the darkness below. The hotel was gone, the demons vanquished, but the souls of the damned still lingered. Somewhere, deep within that abyss, they waited, forever trapped, forever watching.